I'm Sheryl Vogt, Director of the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon. Our program today is titled A Rush to Judgment, the Warren Commission and the Dissent of Richard Russell. That the American public has never been fully satisfied with the Warren report is an understatement, I believe. I've always thought that the story of Senator Russell's frustration at being in what he called an untenable position was one worthy of examination. Since a new group of classified records have recently been released in the last few months from at National Archives, that is on the investigation of the assassination, it seemed like the perfect time to take up the senator's misgivings as seen by those who were closest to him during that time, his time on the commission. So to set the scene, so to speak, we're going to listen to two audio tapes of White House conversations between LBJ and Senator Russell. These were done on November the 29th, 1963. This is when President Johnson pressed Senator Russell into serving on the Warren Commission. And then the second one is on September the 18th, 1964, following the last executive session of the Warren Commission. I want to let you know or be aware that we have done everything we can to amplify the volume on these. These early recordings were over the telephone with equipment very much unlike what we use today. So getting Senator Russell's voice as the person on the other end of the phone, speaking of phones, was, maybe he's calling us now, but anyway, trying to get Russell's volume up to really hear what he was saying, we get some sounds, and those who are familiar with media can tell us what it is, but it's like a boom, boom, boom sort of sound in the audio. But I think you can sort of, get rid of that and really listen to the conversation. Also, following the two audio tapes, we're going to watch a segment from a documentary on Senator Russell that was done by WSB Television in 1969. And in that documentary, he reflects on his service with the Warren Commission. We were supposed to have three people participating in our program today, but unfortunately, Earl Leonard, who was our third panelist, has had to cancel because of illness. But we will have Charles Campbell, who will speak first, and then we will sit down and have a conversation with him and Powell more. So let's listen now to Senator Russell.
Hello.
Senator Russell, 2191.
Dick?
Yes?
I hate to bother you again, but
All right, Mr. President.
I wanted you to know that I made an announcement
Announcement what?
of this special commission.
Oh, you have already?
Yes.
All right.
And I got you to hear it. May I read it to you?
Yes.
The President announced that he is appointing a special commission to study and report upon all the facts and circumstances relating to the assassination of the late President John F. Kennedy and the subsequent violent death of the man charged with the assassination. The President stated that the majority and minority leadership of the Senate and the House had been consulted with respect to the full special commission. The members of the special commission are Chief Justice Earl Warren, Chairman; Senator Richard Russell, Georgia; Senator John Cooper, Kentucky; Representative Hale Boggs, Louisiana; Representative Gerald Ford, Michigan; Honorable Allen Dulles, Washington; Honorable John J. McCloy, New York.
Well, now, Mr. President, I know I don't have to tell you my devotion to you, but I just can't serve on that commission. I'm highly honored you think about me in connection with it, but I couldn't serve there with Chief Justice Warren. I don't like that man. I don't have any confidence in him, though I realize he's a much greater man in the United States today than almost anyone.
You're my man on that commission, and you're going to do it. And don't tell me what you can do and what you can't, because I can't arrest you, and I'm not going to put the FBI on you, but you're goddamn sure going to serve, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I can't do it, I haven't got the time.
Oh, well, now, well, all right, we'll just make the time.
All my Georgia items in there?
Well, we'll just make the time. There's not going to be any time to begin with. All you're going to do is evaluate a Hoover report he's already made. But
I'm going to move that fast, don't I?
well, okay. Well, then we won't move any faster than you want to move. You're gonna lend your name to this thing because you're head of the CIA committee in the Senate, and you're gonna have Fulbright and Hickenlooper on it because this thing is breaking faster than you think. And I already talked to Hickenlooper and Fulbright and asked them to go with you, sit on your committee because I don't want these things torn up. Secretary of State came over here this afternoon. He's deeply concerned, Dick, about the idea that they're spreading throughout the communist world that Khrushchev killed Kennedy. Now, he didn't. He didn't have a damn thing to do with it.
Well, I don't think he did directly.
Well,
No, Khrushchev didn't, because he thought he'd get along better with Kennedy.
all right, but we got to have some people.
I wouldn't be surprised if Castro had it.
All right, then okay, that's what we want to know. And people got confidence in you, and you can just be surprised or not surprised. They want to know what you think. And if my A.W. Morrison's the one wants to know what you think, and
You sort of take advantage of it, Mr. President, but
No.
of course I keep telling you.
no, you're not. I'm not taking advantage of you. I'm gonna take a hell of a lot of advantage of you, my friend, because you made me, and I know it, and I don't ever forget. And if you think I'll be taking advantage of you, good deal. I'm a Russell protege, and I don't forget my friends, and I want you to stand up and be counted, and I don't want to beg you, by God, to serve on these things that amount to something.
No, but this is a sort of rough one now.
No, it's not rough. What's rough about this? I talked to Jim Eastland. Jim Eastland said it's the best thing ever happened.
Yeah?
Jim Eastland, I talked to Tom Dodd. I talked to everybody. Not a damn one of them that all these folks are going to be for this.
Yeah, well, I'm sure they will. Well,
No, they're not. Hell, they had a full-scale investigation going, Dick, with the television up there. They had the House Un-American Activities Committee in
well, all of that was a lot of crap, and they shouldn't have done it.
Well, of course, but how do I stop it? How do I stop it, Dick? Now, don't tell me that I've worked all day and done wrong.
I didn't say you'd done wrong. I said that they ought not to have had that kind of a hearing, and it ought to have been stopped. And he could have been stopped some other way. But that's
Well, now, what do you think?
stopped it in the Senate.
What do you think I've done wrong now by appointing you on a commission?
Well, I just don't like Warren.
Well, of course you don't like Warren, but you'll like him before it's over with.
I haven't got any confidence.
Well, you can give him some confidence. God damn it. You associate with him. Now, you've got nothing to...
Well,
I'm not afraid to put your intelligence against Warren's. Now, by God, I want a man on that commission, and I've got one.
I don't know about the intelligence, of course, but and I feel like I'm being kidded. But if you think
Well, if you think you did, Dick, now, do you think I kid you?
the country, you know damn well I'd do it, and I'd do it for you for that matter.
Dick,
I still feel like
No.
I'm sort of getting wrapped up.
Dick, do you remember when you met me at the Carlton Hotel in 1952 when we had breakfast there one morning and I became leader?
Yes, I think I do.
All right. Do you think I'm kidding you?
No, I don't think you kidding me.
All right.
But I think well, I'm not going to say any more, Mr. President.
Well, you-
I'm at your command, and
All
I'm
right. Well, you damn sure going to be at my command? You're going to be at my command as long as I'm here. Hello?
Yes, sir.
Well, you always leaving town. You must not like it up here.
Well, you left. I figured that if you got out of town, that the country could get along a whole lot better without me than it could you.
I don't know.
So I got out. No, that dang Warren Commission business has whooped me down, so we got through today, and I just, you know what I did? I went over and got on the plane, came home. I didn't even have a toothbrush. I didn't bring a shirt. I got a few little things here. I didn't even have my pills, antihistamine pills, to take care of me if I seen them.
Why did you get in such a rush?
Well, I just worn out fighting over that damn report.
Well, you'll take another hour and go and get your clothes.
No. Well, they were trying to prove that
same bullet that hit Kennedy first was the one that hit Connolly. Went through him and through his hand, his bone, and into his leg, and everything else. Just a lot of stuff there. I couldn't hear all the evidence and cross-examine all of them. But I did read the record, and so I don't know. I was the only fellow there that didn't practically that suggested any change whatever and what the staff had got up. This staff business always scares me. I like to put my own views down. But we got you a pretty good report.
Well, what difference did it make which bullet got Connolly?
Well, it don't make much difference, but they said that they believe that the commission believed that the same bullet that hit Kennedy hit Connolly. Well, I don't believe it.
I don't either.
And so I couldn't sign it. And I said that Governor Connolly testified directly to the contrary, and I'm not going to approve of that. So I finally made them say there was a difference in the commission in that. Part of them believed that wasn't so. And of course, if the fellow was accurate enough to hit Kennedy right in the neck on one shot and knock his head off the next one when he was leaning up against his wife's head, not even wound up. Well, he didn't miss completely with that third shot. According to their theory, he not only missed the whole automobile, but he missed the street. Well, the man's a good enough shot to put 2 bullets right in Kennedy. He didn't miss that whole automobile. Nor the street. Anyhow, that's just a little thing. But
What's the net of the whole thing? What does it say? Oswald did it, and he did it for any reason?
Well, just that he was a general misanthropic fellow, that he had never been satisfied anywhere he was on earth, in Russia or here, and that he had a desire to get his name in history and all. I don't think you'll be displeased with the report. It's too long, but it's a whole volume.
Unanimous?
Yes, sir. I tried my best to get into this end, but they'd come around and trade me out of it by giving me a little old thread of it. I have never been completely satisfied with the report. Now, I don't mean by that I think there's any great omission, but I think it could have been made much more convincing with the evidence we had if it had been tied more closely together. In the first place, Mariner Oswald was never examined as she should have been. I gave her about 40 minutes of cross-examination in Dallas, right at the end of the hearings, which is really the first that she had ever had. Chief Justice Warren, of course, was Chief Justice, but he rather took the grandfather attitude toward her when she was for the commission. And Mr. Rankin was not very vigorous. I don't know just what else they could have brought out. But I was not satisfied with several aspects of the report, but as far as the general conclusion concerned, that Oswald was the man who fired the shots, and he acted alone. I think that any other commission that you might appoint today would arrive at that conclusion. Now, there are a number of other things in it that might come out differently.
Well, what do you think about the fact that some records the American people aren't going to see for many, many years?
Well, they have to do almost altogether with the autopsy on the president. That's it. I don't think there's anything there. It's just of a technical nature that would change the report in any degree.
The only other papers that I can really think of are the so-called CIA reports of his any time he might have spent in Mexico City. And remember, I used the term might.
Yes, but that was available to us.
Not to the public.
No, it was not made available to the public because there were some international complications. The Mexicans, as you well know, have always been rather suspicious of us. And they have never withdrawn their recognition from Cuba. Their ties are quite close with Cuba today, Castro and Mexico. And I think that caused a commitment to be made that any evidence that might relate to Oswald's efforts to go to Cuba would not be disclosed. That's just my idea about it.
Let me,
I have never believed that Oswald planned that all together by himself. There were too many things that his fact that when he was at Minsk, and that was the principal center for educating Cuban students, there were 600, 700 of them there, he was very close to some of them. And the trip that he made to Mexico City, and a number of discrepancies in the evidence as to, or conflicts in the evidence as to his means of transportation, the luggage that he had, and whether or not anyone was with him, caused me to have doubts that he planned it all by himself. I think if someone else worked with him.
I was going to ask you, did you then...
And I refused to sign the report until they put in the clause. I had drawn a much stronger one, but I finally agreed to sign if they would put a clause in there that we had exhausted all the evidence that was available to us, and that any evidence that might disclose a conspiracy, I was beyond the jurisdiction of our police bodies, the FBI and the Secret Service.
What you're saying then is Oswald's motives might not have been just personal.
Oh, I don't
Might
think
have
they're
been,
personal at all.
politically motivated.
I think the fact that you recall there were so many circumstances. One of them being that he was free Cuba, a defender of Cuba, and went on the radio in New Orleans and got out pamphlets and handed them out on the streets. And there's so many circumstances there that led me to believe that you couldn't just completely eliminate the possibility that he did have some co-conspirators in there.
And this may be an unfair question, and you may not want to answer it.
Well,
Are you then implying that he could have possibly accepted this as an assignment, perhaps many months earlier?
He could have felt it to that degree. I don't think Oswald was a completely normal person. He at one time, he was a rampant communist. After he lived in Russia for a time, he claimed that he had changed his mind. But after he got back to this country, when he got to the free soil of the United States again, he tended to turn back toward communism. So, as to whether it was an assignment or whether it was a conspiracy, or whether he did it with the knowledge of certain people in the thought that he was helping some communist states, I'm not prepared to say because we didn't have enough evidence to pin it down. But I say I am not completely satisfied in my own mind that he did plan and commit this act altogether on his own without consultation with anyone else. And that was what a majority of the commission wanted to find.
The Senate, the club, the establishment, or wait.
It's good to hear directly from someone who was involved. A native of Jackson, Georgia, Charles Campbell was raised on a small cattle farm where he nurtured the dream of becoming a trial lawyer one day. From public school in Jackson, he came to UGA, and shortly before graduating with a political science degree, Charles met Senator Richard B. Russell when he introduced him for a Blue Key Award. Actually, Russell was giving a Blue Key speech on campus. And soon after, he accepted an offer to work as a legislative assistant on the Russell staff in Washington. So he arrived there in January 1966. He was promoted to executive secretary and subsequently to administrative assistant by the age of 26, where he continued until Senator Russell's death in January 1971. After receiving his law degree in June of that year from Georgetown Law Center, he returned to Atlanta to realize his boyhood dream, and he was founder and trial lawyer with the firm of Hicks, Maloof, and Campbell, which merged with McKenna, Long, and Aldrich, where he continued to practice until his retirement in 2009. By 2013, he had written his autobiography, published by Mercer University Press, entitled Senator Richard B. Russell and My Career as a Trial Lawyer. Charles was the fourth chair of the Richard B. Russell Foundation, a position he held for 17 years. Charles.
Thank you, Sheryl, and thank you for your 40-plus years of outstanding leadership for the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies. The idea for this program was prompted in part by a master's thesis written by a graduate student at the College of William and Mary a few years ago, entitled The First Dissenter, Richard B. Russell and the Warren Commission, by Dana Biancali. That has prompted scholars to start studying Senator Russell's role in the Warren Commission. And in fact, this thesis was made a chapter in a book that was published by a different professor later entitled Breach of Trust. As you gathered from the first telephone conversation with President Johnson, Senator Russell didn't have the best of relationships with Chief Justice Warren. That was only one of the reasons he didn't want to serve on this commission. He was at the time chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and very shortly, President Johnson started to escalate the Vietnam War, which made the work of the committee even more onerous. He was also, in effect, chairman of the Appropriations Committee because Carl Hayden was entering the end of his term and was often absent because of advancing age. He was over 90 years old and declining health, so Russell had to take over. He was chairman of the busiest subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee, the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. And he was chairman, as you heard in the recorded conversation, of the Senate Oversight Committee of the CIA. So he had a lot of reasons not to want to serve. It would be an understatement to say he was the most unwilling member of the commission. And you could gather from the telephone call that he wasn't any too happy about being appointed. In fact, he made a note in a notebook he maintained on November 29, which was the date of the first telephone conversation. He said, quote, and this is here in his files at the Russell Library, quote, LBJ called twice about the Oswald Commission, took advantage of me, end quote. And that was the way he viewed it. But looking at it now from hindsight and history, LBJ might have gotten more than he bargained for, because Senator Russell became the most consequential member of the commission. And he was the closest thing on the commission to a troublemaker. A troublemaker in the sense that there was a rush to judgment, and he declined to join in it. There was a rush to judgment before the Warren Commission was ever formed. On November the 25th, 1963, the Deputy Attorney General, Nicholas Katzenbach, wrote a memorandum, which was delivered to Bill Moyers, one of the senior aides to LBJ at the White House. This was 3 days after President Kennedy was assassinated. It was 1 day after Jack Ruby murdered Oswald as he was being transferred from one Dallas jail to another. And it was 4 days before the Warren Commission was appointed. And in this memorandum, in the first paragraph, he outlines the game plan. This followed several meetings he had with J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI. And in this first paragraph, he says, what we must do is convince the American people in the Congress that Oswald acted alone and there are no co-conspirators still at large. He said the way to do that is to have the FBI release a report, which you heard President Johnson refer to in his telephone conversation with Senator Russell. So finding, and such a report was released. In the last paragraph, he said, if this doesn't do the job, it might be necessary for the president to appoint a blue ribbon panel of distinguished Americans who will study the FBI report and reach the same conclusion. And you heard in the telephone conversation almost those exact words from LBJ. When Senator Russell was protesting, I don't have the time, he said, it isn't going to take much time. All you're going to do is review an FBI report. So that was the game plan at the highest levels of the U.S. government. Of course, Senator Russell didn't know about the Katzenbach memo, but he soon saw the fruits of it, not only in his telephone conversation with President Johnson on November 29th, but in his dealings with Chief Justice Warren. On December 5th, 1963, the first executive session of the Warren Commission took place, the so-called organizational meeting. And before it even started, Chief Justice Warren called Senator Russell aside and started asking him a series of detailed questions about Oswald's visit to Mexico 3 weeks before the assassination. And it immediately became apparent to Senator Russell that Chief Justice Warren could only know about that if he had received high-level classified information briefings from the CIA. He knew that other members of the Warren Commission had not received them because he hadn't received them as a member of the Warren Commission. He knew about this information because in his capacity as chairman of the CIA Oversight Committee, he received such briefings every month. So that caused him great concern going into the meeting. And then what happened at the beginning of the meeting caused him even more concern. He made a note, which is the second paragraph of the note that's on the screen now. This is his handwriting that he made during the executive session. He had a habit of making notes on these kind of Senate memoranda, pink memo slips, as we call them. And he says something strange is happening. W. and Katzenbach, Chief Justice Warren had invited Nicholas Katzenbach, who wrote the November 25 memo, to come to the first meeting. He said something strange is happening. W. and Katzenbach know all about FBI, and they are basically making the judgment Oswald acted alone. And Senator Russell was highly disturbed that that conclusion would be arrived at before the investigation ever started. In his view, why have a commission if you've already come up with the answer before the investigation commences? Chief Justice Warren also started off the meeting by saying that it was not necessary for the Warren Commission to have its own staff, that it could rely on the FBI and the CIA to conduct the investigation, and consistent with what LBJ said in the telephone conversation, then the commission's role would be to review the reports. Senator Russell immediately objected, and he said several things that were highly, highly prophetic based on what we now know. He said, first of all, he said, let's not fool ourselves. The reputation of every single one of us is on the line here. And if we don't conduct the kind of investigation the seriousness of this matter requires, we will be forever condemned. And in answer to the question, or to the assertion by Chief Justice Warren that the commission could rely on the CIA and the FBI to conduct the investigation, he said, I probably worked as long and as closely with these two agencies as anybody at this table. But let me tell you something. For the purpose of this investigation, we need to have a very skeptical mind. And we need to assume that if the interests of these agencies conflict with giving us the full story, we're unlikely to receive it. So he led the fight at this first executive session to have an independent staff, which eventually would be 20 to 25 lawyers, to conduct an independent investigation. Ultimately, at Senator Russell's urging, and even a reluctant Chief Justice Warren agreed that, yeah, that's what we should do. So they appointed a subcommittee. Senator Russell was not on the subcommittee, to hire a staff director who would then hire additional lawyers. And the subcommittee selected and recommended to the full commission Lee Rankin, who Senator Russell referred to in the questioning of Marina Oswald in the video you saw. And he appeared to be well qualified on paper. He was a prominent lawyer in New York. In the Eisenhower administration, he had been the Solicitor General, which is the top Justice Department official that argues cases before the Supreme Court, which is presumably how Chief Justice Warren met him. But if your goal was Senator Russell's goal of having an independent, thorough investigation and following the evidence wherever it might lead, he was a poor choice, because he immediately bought into the rush to judgment. And he established a set of rules that would govern the investigation that assured that, number one, the staff conducting the investigation would be largely isolated from each other, and they would be isolated from the members of the commission. He divided the staff into teams of 2 or 3 lawyers, and each team was given a certain area to investigate, like Oswald's background, his time in Russia, his time in Mexico. And they would not only examine all the documents in their area of responsibility, but they would interrogate the witnesses, and they'd even write the final report, or the chapter of the final report covering their area of responsibility. Only Rankin saw the total picture, not these people that were doing the work. He also imposed a rule that said that no member of the staff except him would be allowed to attend any meeting, any executive session of the Warren Commission. So if a commissioner had a question, they got the answer from Rankin. And even if he hadn't bought into the rush to judgment, no one could know all the information from such a complex and involved investigation, but the staff members doing 99% of the work were not there to respond to inquiries. And then the final thing he did was he said that no new areas of inquiry can be opened without his permission. And he was very reluctant to give it. So that if, for example, a lead was developed and you wanted to do something that was kind of outside your original assignment, generally he said no. For example, there was a Mexican woman who had previously worked at the Cuban embassy, and the staff of the commission learned that Oswald had met twice with this Cuban woman while he was in Mexico. So the staff member responsible for this area said, we need to take her deposition and find out why Oswald was meeting with her. Well, Rankin said no. He said the time has come to close areas of inquiry, not open new ones. Chief Justice Warren supported Rankin and observed, we do not need to take the testimony of a communist. The woman was never deposed. And that's just one example. In fact, one member of the staff became so frustrated that he actually resigned and went back to his private law practice and left the commission staff. Of course, Senator Russell and the other commissioners, with the possible exception of Chief Justice Warren, if Rankin told him, would not have been aware that that was going on. Then Senator Russell attended the first 3 executive sessions, the one on December 5th and another one in late December and then one in early January. And then something happened that Lyndon Johnson well knew was going to happen because he was orchestrating and dictating the schedule. The Senate took up the 1964 Civil Rights Act in mid-January. And President Johnson well knew, because Senator Russell had been head of the Southern group of senators since 1948, LBJ's first year in the Senate. So Senator Russell was largely absent after these first 3 executive sessions. Unless the Warren Commission met on the weekends or at night, which was rare, he was on the Senate floor. His attendance record was the worst among all the other commissioners, 6% of the hearings he attended. The record of all the commissioners wasn't great at 45%. The 4 commissioners with the worst attendance record were the 4 members of Congress, because they still had their legislative duties. Chief Justice Warren was somewhere in the middle, because although he continued to serve as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he could arrange the schedule of the court so that it didn't interfere with the Warren Commission activities. The 2 best attendance records were the 2 retired members, Allen Dulles, the former director of the CIA, and John McCloy, who had been High Commissioner for Germany after World War II. But Senator Russell tried to keep up. He would later say this was the most exhausting, stressful, and taxing period of his life. He would read the record at night. Many nights during this period, he didn't even go back to his apartment. He slept on a couch for a few hours in his office and continued to read the transcripts. And as he read, he became more frustrated because he wasn't seeing the kind of investigation he thought was going to take place. He referred in the video to the inadequacy of the Marina Oswald testimony. That was just one example. As his frustration grew, the straw that kind of broke the camel's back, so to speak, was the testimony of Robert Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's brother. Senator Russell felt that the Oswald family had the key to information that they probably wouldn't get anywhere else. and he wanted to be sure there was a thorough interrogation of any Oswald family member who testified. He woke up one Saturday morning and he read in the Washington Post that Robert Oswald was going to be testifying that day before the Warren Commission. His office had received no notice of this. So he hurriedly got dressed and came down to the office. His office was always open for at least a half a day on Saturdays. And he asked an aide to call over to the Warren Commission and find out where the hearing was taking place. There was no answer to the phone. So the aide, the Warren Commission office was in a nearby building, so he went over there. Office was closed, the lights were off. So Senator Russell assumed the Washington Post had been wrong and that Oswald wasn't testifying that day. Well, he was testifying, just at a different location. He missed it. And that kind of boiled over, you might say. He sat down and he dictated a resignation letter. And it's on the screen now, and it says not sent. But he dictated it, and in it, among other things, he said it is not reasonable to expect someone to serve on an important investigatory body and not be timely notified of important hearings. He went down to the White House with his resignation letter, presented it to President Johnson. President Johnson said absolutely not. Said it will destroy the effectiveness of this commission if you resign because the press won't focus on anything other than your resignation. The national interest requires you to stay on this commission. And Senator Russell reluctantly agreed to do so. He later told me in 1968 that the worst mistake he ever made was when he allowed President Johnson to coerce him into serving on the commission. And the second worst mistake he ever made was when he allowed President Johnson to talk him out of resigning from the commission. But apparently President Johnson was very concerned about what Senator Russell might do. So he called Chief Justice Warren and told him about Senator Russell's effort to resign. And early the next Monday morning, Lee Rankin, the staff director of the Warren Commission, was in Senator Russell's office, profusely apologizing for the miscommunication and saying to assure that will never happen again, he recommended Senator Russell hire a staff member that would report only to him, but would be on the Warren Commission payroll. Senator Russell called his nephew, Judge Robert L. Russell, Jr., who was a member of the Georgia Court of Appeals in Atlanta. And Judge Russell recommended a young law clerk at the Court of Appeals named Alfreda Scobie. She came to Washington, and she was the eyes and ears of Senator Russell for the remainder of the Warren Commission deliberations. She couldn't go to the executive sessions because of the rule that Rankin imposed, but she could keep him up to date on the schedule, and if he had an area he wanted research based on his reading, she could do that. In mid-June of 1964, the civil rights fight ended when the Senate invoked cloture and President Johnson signed the bill into law. Just as an aside, when other Southern politicians were stirring up violence and unrest in the South, Senator Russell, in his very first public speech in Georgia, after the act was signed into law, called on all Georgians to comply with the law, whether they agreed with it or not. And he said it is our duty as good and patriotic citizens to comply with the law and to avoid at all costs all violence and unrest. And then he dived back into his Warren Commission work. He called up Chief Justice Warren and he said that the interrogation of Marina Oswald was entirely inadequate. And he recommended that a subcommittee be appointed to go back to Texas, as he said in the video, and examine her again. Chief Justice Warren appointed Senator Russell, Senator Cooper, and Congressman Boggs as that special committee, and they went to Texas. Senator Russell led the interrogation of Marina Oswald. It lasted for about 4.5 hours at a military base outside Dallas. And Senator Cooper, who did an oral history interview for the Russell Library after Senator Russell died in 1971, says in his oral history interview that Russell's question was thorough and penetrating. It didn't develop any smoking gun admissions, but it did show a number of contradictions and inconsistencies in Marina Oswald's testimony, strengthening Senator Russell's view that she was not telling the truth and that she was hiding information. While Senator Russell was in Dallas, He went to the Texas School Book Depository. This is a picture that appeared in the Atlanta newspaper. He's on the 6th floor where Oswald allegedly fired the shots. He even took a rifle while he was there and sighted to see what kind of angle and what kind of shot Oswald had, because at the time there was a growing controversy. Some people didn't believe Oswald had time to fire 3 shots. They had pinpointed the time from the time the presidential motorcade came into Oswald's view on the 6th floor of the School Book Depository to the time it went out of view at between 6.5 and 7 seconds. And many people were claiming you couldn't fire 3 shots within that period because it was a single bolt rifle that had to be rebolted after each shot and re-aimed and fired. Senator Russell came to the conclusion that a marksman, and Oswald had obtained that distinction during his Marine Corps training, could possibly fire 3 shots. So he declined to join the group that were urging there must be 2 shooters and a conspiracy, because he couldn't have fired 3 shots. Something else happened shortly before Senator Russell went to Dallas that would have a profound impact on the Warren Commission report and on Senator Russell's views of the report. A leak occurred from the Warren Commission. Yes, they had leaks even back in the 1960s. And the Dallas newspaper wrote an article that said the Warren Commission was nearing the end of its work, and it would find that there were 3 shots fired by Oswald. The first one hit President Kennedy in the back and exited his throat. The second one caused the injuries of Governor Connally, and the third one was the fatal headshot that killed President Kennedy. That had been the working hypothesis throughout the entire investigation. That was the conclusion of the FBI in its report. But this Dallas newspaper article was read by a man named James Teague, a resident of Dallas, and he immediately knew that couldn't be true, because on the day of the assassination, he was watching the presidential procession, and a bullet hit a curb where he was standing and caused cement fragments to fly up in his face and bloody his face. There were 2 eyewitnesses to it that made statements to the Dallas police, and a Dallas police officer standing nearby actually made an official report to the Dallas police. But some way or another, this never made its way to the Warren Commission staff. They didn't know about it. So Teague calls the reporter that wrote the article in the Dallas paper, and by the way, it turned out to be Jim Lara of the McNeil-Lara NewsHour later, and said he had information that indicated that if, in fact, this is what the Warren Commission was finding was wrong. So Lara went out and interviewed Teague and wrote another article. This one did come to the attention of the commission staff. And so this presented a big, big problem, because if 3 separate shots hit occupants of the car and a bullet hit the curb, there were 4 shots fired. Oswald was already being alleged not to have been able to fire 3. No one would contend he could fire 4. So what do? Well, the team on the Warren Commission staff that was responsible for this area, headed, ironically, by a young Pennsylvania lawyer by the name of Arlen Specter, who later turned out to be a powerful senator from Pennsylvania who served in the Senate for 25 years and was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. So Specter started about trying to figure out, how am I going to reconcile this? And he consulted a number of experts, and he found 2 experts who were prepared to say that it was entirely possible, in fact likely, that the first bullet that went into President Kennedy's back and exited his throat was the one that caused injuries to Governor Connally. And the second bullet was the fatal headshot, and the third bullet missed the limousine altogether. And this was the way they changed, and this became the famous single bullet theory that Senator Russell ultimately objected to. Now, they handled it in a very, very shrewd but misleading way. They didn't come out and say the bullet that missed the limousine was the Teague bullet. The only thing they said in the conclusion section is that the third bullet missed the limousine. In fact, they tried to discredit Teague's story by putting it in a section of an appendix to the report. There were 26 volumes. This is in one of the appendices. And it implied, this was in a part of the report where they were debunking various theories that the commission didn't agree with, like they were shots from the front of the limousine as opposed to the rear of the limousine. In fact, they went to the trouble to have the curb cut because Teague took him and showed him where he was standing. And there was a mark on the curb that looked, like a bullet mark. Of course, this was 8 months after the assassination, so it wasn't exactly an intact crime scene. There'd been street repairs, weather, but after extensive testing, they said it was inconclusive as to whether it was a bullet mark or not. So that was kind of the way they dealt with the Teague bullet. And scholars are now increasingly saying they don't believe Senator Russell knew about the Teague bullet because he didn't mention it in his dissent. In the telephone conversation, the second one with President Johnson, when Johnson said, well, what difference does it make which bullet hit Connally, he said, not much. Well, it made all the difference in the world because that meant there were 4. Senator Russell would have either having to give up on his objection to the single bullet theory, or he'd have to strengthen his dissent and not only say that there was a possibility of a conspiracy, but there was one. As he was reading the draft reports for the final commission report, he identified the 2 issues that have most dogged the Warren Commission report in the 50 years since it was issued. The categorical finding of no conspiracy and the single bullet theory. And on September 16, 1974, he prepared a dissent, which is on the screen now. The only copy of this that has survived is the one here at the Russell Library. He disagreed with the no conspiracy finding for the reasons he explained pretty thoroughly, I think, in the video you saw. That is, there was just too much unknown information about Oswald and his activities in Russia and in Mexico. On the single bullet theory, he had 3 reasons why he would not agree to it. Number 1, Governor Connally and his wife, who were seated in a jump seat of the limousine in front of the Kennedys. Governor Connally, who was an experienced deer hunter and rifleman, testified before the commission that when the first shot was fired, he turned to tried to look toward the back seat. He did not get a clear angle of President Kennedy, a clear view of President Kennedy because of the angle. But that he had not been hit at that time, that he was hit several seconds later. His wife, Nellie Connally, testified that when the first bullet was fired, she turned and looked, and President Kennedy was holding his hand up to his throat, which was confirmed by film footage that an amateur photographer, Abraham Zabruta, had made, the famous Zabruta film. And she said at that time her husband had not been hit. Senator Russell's second reason was that the so-called single bullet was marked as Warren Commission Exhibit 399, and it was in almost pristine condition. And Senator Russell did not believe that a bullet that went through President Kennedy's back, exited his throat, went into Governor Connally's back, fractured one of his ribs, exited his front, smashed several bones in his wrist, and lodged in his thigh, would have been in pristine condition. It would have had evidence of the bone fragments that it had hit and caused. And his third reason was he didn't believe that someone who could fire with that deadly of accuracy would have missed the entire limousine with the third shot. So with that, he prepared this dissent. He called up Chief Justice Warren and said there were certain matters that he could not agree to and asked for another executive session. Now, it's important to remember that the commission had had, I think it was 13 prior executive sessions. Every single one of them had been reported verbatim by a Washington court reporting firm. But this one was not, because Lee Rankin saw to it the court reporter was not ordered. When Senator Russell entered the conference room, he told me this later, there was a lady sitting at the desk where the court reporter always sat. So he assumed it was being verbatim recorded, but apparently it was not. The only evidence of that executive session was a summary, very pro forma, with nothing of substance in it, that Lee Rankin prepared. No mention of the Russell dissent, no mention of any debate, and no mention of any changes in the report. Senator Russell presented his dissent on the grounds that I've already indicated. And Senator Cooper said in his oral history here at the Russell Library that he immediately completely agreed with it, and that Congressman Boggs largely agreed with it. So, contrary to this facade of unanimity, what you actually had within the Warren Commission was an almost evenly divided commission. You had 3 commissioners on critical points that didn't agree with the draft of the report. Chief Justice Warren said that it was not permissible to have a dissent, that this had to be a unanimous report, that the entire work of this commission would be fruitless if you had a dissent. Chief Justice Warren was smart enough to realize that he was probably not the one to try to talk Senator Russell out of his dissent. So somebody got John McCloy, who was a member of the commission, and as I said earlier, had been the High Commissioner of Germany after World War II. Senator Russell had known him since World War II and had great respect for him. So he took the lead, and he said, well, let's see if we can arrive at some language that will satisfy Senator Russell. I understand his points, and Senator Cooper. So he started proposing alternative language on these 2 points that Russell had dissented on. Russell turned down a bunch of his suggestions, and finally they agreed to language that Russell accepted. On the no conspiracy, they changed the language to say, while it is impossible to prove a negative, that is, there was no conspiracy. If there was a conspiracy, no evidence of it came to the attention of the commission. And on the single bullet theory, compromise language said that ballistic experts have testified that the first bullet went through President Kennedy's back and throat and caused Governor Connolly's injuries. However, because of the testimony of Governor Connolly and certain other factors, certain members of the commission do not agree with this conclusion. However, all members of the commission agree that all of the shots that caused injuries to President Kennedy or Governor Connolly were fired from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. With that, they had their unanimous report. Senator Russell assumed that he had made a record for history, that eventually, originally, President Johnson said that all the records would be embargoed from public view for 75 years. That didn't hold up. But Russell knew that at some point, the record would be made public, or at least he thought that he had made a record. The next item is a photograph of, should be a photograph of the Warren Commission presenting their final report. Maybe we don't have that. That's okay, it's not essential. It was in late September. President Johnson imposed a deadline on the commission that you have to finish your report before the presidential election, the first week in November of '64. And so by the end of September, they got the report up, went down to the White House and presented it to the president. Chief Justice Warren standing next to President Johnson, and Senator Russell standing next to Chief Justice Warren. Senator Russell, as he said in the video, was never fully satisfied, but he wanted to put it behind him. He considered it to be a very disagreeable episode in his Senate career. Initially, the report got good reception, got extensive publicity, the commission was praised, but then, as usually happens in a democracy, details started coming out. The LBJ secretly recorded telephone conversations at the White House that you heard were released. Senator Russell's papers were opened here at the Russell Library, included his resignation letter and his dissent, and Senator Cooper's oral history interview was opened. So scholars started saying there's something bad wrong here. And the pressure got so intense that the House of Representatives appointed an assassination commission. And they, after about a year's work, concluded that the Warren Commission had inadequately investigated the possibility of a conspiracy, and that in all likelihood President Kennedy was assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. Then, in the early 1990s, Oliver Stone made the movie JFK, which embraced one of the conspiracy theories that was going about at that time, that the CIA had led the conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. Then information came out that the CIA had submitted misleading and incomplete information to the Warren Commission, and that the FBI had actually destroyed evidence, including a note that Oswald wrote just weeks before the assassination, where he threatened to blow up the Dallas FBI office and kill everyone there. That note, immediately after the assassination, was destroyed by the Dallas office of the FBI. Should have been turned over to the Warren Commission. Of course, both the CIA and the FBI had extensive files on Oswald. The CIA with respect to his activities outside the United States, the FBI with respect to his activities in the United States. None of that information was turned over to the Secret Service that was responsible for President Kennedy's security on his trip to Dallas. So it is no surprise today that a majority of the American people don't believe the Warren Commission report and believe that there was a conspiracy. In the next section of the program, we will cover how Senator Russell found out in 1968 that there was no mention of his dissent in the Warren Commission files at the National Archives. Thank you.
Howell Moore is now going to join us in a conversation about what it was like to work in Senator Russell's office during that time. Both he and Charles held senior positions in the senator's office. This was a time when he was widely regarded as the most influential and powerful U.S. senator. Howell Moore was born in Milledgeville, Georgia, where he attended preparatory school at Georgia Military College. He then graduated with a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Georgia in 1959. Powell has been actively engaged in legislative affairs, public policy development, national security, and international relations for nearly 50 years. After spending about 4 years as an infantry officer in the U.S. Army, he began his career in politics in 1966 when Senator Russell appointed him as his press secretary. Following Russell's death, Powell was on the White House legislative staff under Presidents Nixon and Ford in 1973 and 74, and under President Reagan in 1981, when he was appointed to serve Reagan as Deputy Assistant to the President for Legislative Affairs. In 1982, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of State for Intergovernmental and Legislative Affairs. And in 1998, he returned to the Senate to become Chief of Staff for Senator Fred Thompson of Tennessee. In the first term of the George W. Bush administration, he was Assistant Secretary of Defense for Legislative Affairs and received the Defense Department's Medal for Distinguished Public Service for his leadership in this position. By 2006, he was appointed representative of the U.S. Secretary of Defense to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and in this capacity was stationed in Vienna, Austria for 3 years. In addition to his federal service, Powell has more than 25 years of experience advising and representing clients on public policy and legislation in Washington. So we're really glad to have Howell join us today. And
thank you very much, Sheryl. Let me echo what Charles said and express my appreciation to Sheryl Vogt for the exceptional job she's done for more than 40 years as the director of the Richard B. Russell Library. We've been very fortunate to have the benefit of her service, and we thank you.
thank you.
Let me also say that one of the best things that can happen to you is to be put on a panel with Charles Campbell. Charles brought the level of analysis and intellectual curiosity to this program today that had made him one of the leading trial lawyers in the state of Georgia over the past couple of decades. And I learned a lot from his presentation, I'll have to say. I arrived on the scene in November, actually late October of 1966. And I was on Senator Russell's staff in time for all the activity that came as we approached the 3rd anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And I was brand new to the job, working with Senator Russell in his Winder office for a couple of months. and the phone started ringing off the hook in late November from people like John Chancellor and people that I never, as a small town boy from Middle Georgia, had ever had any contact with. But we were getting a lot of inquiries about what was going on. And I talked to the senator about it, and he called in Babs Raisby, his personal secretary, with her dictating pad, and he issued the following statement, which I really accepted as his final word on this very unpleasant experience of being on the, what we were told to refer. Senator Russell was a man who was thought semantics were very important, and he wouldn't, if it was a bill he didn't like it, he'd say it's a so-called such and such a bill. He would never use the euphemistic title that went with it. And I think Charles mentioned that he made a reference to the Oswald Commission, but if you were on his staff and you referred to this commission, you called it the Assassination Commission. You never use the word of the chairman of the commission. He said, immediately after my appointment to the commission to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy, I stated that due to the slaying of Oswald by Ruby and the many imponderables involved, that any report made by the commission would be subject to a question and debate for 100 years. Frankly, I am surprised that more articles and books critical of the report have not already been written. The commission pursued every clue and piece of evidence of any significance, but it must be borne in mind that access to some evidence dealing with the most oft-repeated questions was barred either by the Iron Curtain or Fidel Castro or perished with Oswald. The commission had the full cooperation of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Secret Service, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the state and local police through the country. The report was viewed time and again and discussed in great detail in the effort to harmonize the views of the members. I was responsible for several changes of the language of the report to include caveats, in some instances pointing out the impossibility of dogmatic certainty of some findings. I certainly do not object to do not have any objections whatever to appointing any number of commissions to view this tragedy, although I am of the opinion that in the absence of additional testimony, any of these commissions, whether composed of leaders of the American Bar Association, the Congress, or any other group suggested, would come to the same conclusions. I have not been in touch with the authors of any of the books, nor discussed the hearings with any of them or any journalist, except for an informal basis with two personal friends who are of the Fourth Estate. I think he was referring to Margaret Shannon and another reporter with the Atlanta papers. It is quite easy to raise questions about nearly every aspect of this tragic event and of the Commission's report. I am not completely satisfied with the completeness of some of the answers, but the Commission was compelled to make its report on the basis of the evidence before it and not on speculation, rumors, or questions. While I have not read all the articles and books written about the hearing, I have not known of any instances where the author brought forward any hard testimony to answer the questions that are so easy to raise. In the absence of new facts to answer the questions now subject to these writings, I do not propose to engage in an endless war of words that will never terminate, but only generate new speculation. And I took that as my guidance to be his final answer on this question. And he would talk about the experience of the commission in private conversations and so forth, but we really didn't spend a lot of time dealing with it.
And that prompts me, Powell, to recall, and I don't know if you had a similar experience with Senator Russell, but I traveled pretty extensively with him in the 5 years I worked for him, and he was very free to talk about any aspect of his career. He knew I'd gotten a degree in political science and was interested in politics, and he would talk from the New Deal days of Roosevelt all the way to Nixon. But anytime I asked him about his service on the Warren Commission, he would always say, I don't want to get back into all that. And he would have nothing to say. I don't know if you had a similar.
Yeah, I absolutely had exactly the same experience. This was not just a happy period of his career. And the commission, when I joined the staff in 1966, the experience was 2 years behind us. So it was not something that was on the front burner. We had a lot going on during that period. 1968, we had 2 assassinations, Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. We had the capture of Pueblo. We had the Tet Offensive. We had the uprising in Czechoslovakia that was put down by the Soviet Union. We had a lot of things. And this was just not much of a focus as far as I'm concerned. I did see, he would get questions about it, private conversations and others. And there were a couple of observations that he made. Number one, he said that he told President Johnson that President Lincoln was assassinated 100 years before that. And there were still people who had conspiracy theories associated with the Lincoln assassination. And the same thing would happen with the assassination of President Kennedy. And as he said, that there was always going to be a lot of speculation about this. And I don't know that we'll ever have the final outcome. My life in public affairs, I learned 2 things. Number one, if the facts are on your side, you argue the facts. If the facts are not on your side, you argue the process. And most of the critics of this sad chapter have usually relied on process arguments. And this big release of previously undisclosed documents, I haven't seen anything in the press that produced any new evidence. I'm don't want to sound like an apologist for the Assassination Commission, but I think that this is a sad chapter, and I don't know that there'll ever be any conclusive evidence that's going to reopen it. Other than some that I learned a lot from hearing Charles today, so maybe he's probably got a different view of that.
Well, not necessarily, but it reminds me of something that Senator Russell told President Johnson in one of these different conversations than the one you heard. They were talking about whether or not the Warren Commission report was going to put an end to all this needless speculation. And he said, hell, Mr. President, 100 years from now, they'll be saying you did it.
It didn't take them that long.
Sure enough, there are books out now that claim that Lyndon Johnson was behind it. So,
Yeah, it's all the Stone movie.
I want to ask Charles, you alluded to this in your remarks about this. When did Senator Russell learn that his dissent was not part of the official record at National Archives?
Good question.
that was in June of 1968. He called me in one day and he said, I just ran into a fellow in the hallway in the Capitol that says he has proof that there's no reference to my dissent in the files of the Warren Commission. He didn't say Warren Commission, he said the Assassination Commission at the National Archive. And I find that hard to believe since it was a court reporter there. But he said, I told this gentleman that I did not have time to get back into that. He wanted an appointment with me to present the proof to me. And I told him that I did not have time, but that he could call Mr. Campbell in my office and bring the proof over, and he would prepare a memorandum for me, and we'd take it from there. So shortly after that, I got a telephone call from this Mr. Harold Weisberg, And by that time, he had written 4 books, highly critical of the Warren Commission. The first one was entitled Whitewash, and it got pretty wide circulation. And importantly, he had filed about 10 Freedom of Information Act lawsuits against the federal government, trying to pry loose records of the Warren Commission. You might say he was a Warren Commission nut. But lo and behold, in one of them, a federal judge in Washington ordered the National Archives to release to him the transcripts of the executive sessions. And when he got them, he saw that there was a court report or verbatim transcript for every one of them until that last one. And so he wrote the head of the National Archives a letter and said there must have been some omission that I didn't get a court report or transcript for the last executive session. And he had a letter from the head of the National Archives saying, we have provided you everything that is in the files of the Warren Commission at the National Archives. So I wrote Senator Russell this memorandum. It's on the screen now after my meeting with Mr. Weisberg. And this is the copy I got back from him, because you'll notice at the top there's a handwritten note, and that's Senator Russell's writing, and it says, the only problem I have with this chap, meaning Weisberg, is that he is associated with Garrison, who I do not trust. Garrison was Jim Garrison, the district attorney in New Orleans, who claimed that he had solved the conspiracy problem and that it was led by the CIA. That was the impetus of the Oliver Stone movie in early 90s. But so he didn't. And by the way, that was when I got the memorandum and went back in and talked to him. That was when he told me the worst mistake he'd ever made was allowing President Johnson to coerce him into signing, and the second worst mistake was to delay to talk him out of resigning. So I said, well, Senator, what should I tell Mr. Weisberg? He said, well, tell him that we appreciate him providing the information to us, that we wish him good luck in his continued work, that I am simply too busy at this time to get back into this, but that if that should change, I will let him know. So that's what I did. I called Mr. Weisberg and told him that. He was, of course, disappointed. But to my knowledge, neither Senator Russell nor I talked to him after that. He did write several letters in which he asked for another appointment. Senator Russell always had the same answer. I dictated the response because I knew he hadn't changed his mind. I don't have the time at present, but if it should change, we'll let you know. And I remember when the Georgia Giant film came out that you saw the excerpt from, he wrote us a letter wanting to get a copy of it. And we had decided by then we weren't going to get in the business of distributing that film, so I wrote him a reply and told him to contact Cox Broadcasting's office in Washington. And to my knowledge, we never heard from Mr. Weisberg again.
I was going to say, Powell, talking about Senator Russell not wanting to comment on that, on the Warren Commission again, he did in the 1969 produced film by WSB. That was probably his last public statement about that. And I know you worked a lot with WSB in arranging for that filming. Would you tell us just a little bit about how the topics for that were picked?
Let me, this was a project that WSB, led by Howell Powell, wanted to do, and we were saw it as an opportunity to add to the historical record. And they produced a 3-part series, appeared on WSB, called The Georgia Giant, about Senator Russell. And it appeared in 3 parts, an hour each. And they also created a half-hour version that was shown at a reception in Washington that President Nixon came to. And it was highly attended and highly acclaimed. But to come up with 3 hours of programs, they probably did maybe 12 or 15 hours of interviews. They did some in Washington. They did some that you saw on this front porch in Wilder, Georgia. And this was just a small segment of a very, very complete documentary film.
Well, I think we might ask our audience if they have any questions. Does anyone Yes, Gary.
I really don't have a question, but an observation, and that is how much we're indebted to the Russell Foundation to put together a building like this with the archives that allow on an issue like this for people to go back and research and to understand what a contribution this will be over time on a wide range of issues, to have the historical record where people could come, students could come to learn, and people could come to get the facts to shed light on such important issues of public policy in our country. So I want to thank you and people at the Russell Foundation who have contributed this to the university, to the state of Georgia, to our country.
And if I may respond, Gary Birch has made a great contribution to the Russell legacy also by managing the Russell Symposium that we had. Probably the last one was 6 or 8 years ago, I guess. But he did a wonderful job.
Yeah, let me add, apropos to what Gary is saying, this episode illustrates the value of congressional collections. Because think about it, if it wasn't for Senator Russell's papers, and he was kind of a historian at heart, I think if he hadn't gone into politics and law, I could see him being a university history professor. But he meticulously maintained these little notes on these pink pads like you saw in my presentation, and all of them are here. And he made them during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He made them at meetings with Harry Truman, with Franklin Roosevelt, and so, but in the case of the Warren Commission, if it wasn't for his files, we would have, we don't know what happened to the copy of his dissent that he left at that last executive session. We just know it's not in existence. But the fact that his records were preserved here means that it's here, and his resignation letter is here, and his notes. And if he hadn't seen to it that his files were meticulously preserved, the good, the bad, and the indifferent, then that would have been lost to history.
I want to add something to that. The pink note, dated December the 5th, which is to me the most intriguing note of all in his own handwriting, where he talks about a possibility of a conspiracy. That note we found in a series of 3 envelopes that had been taken from his desk drawer. I understand from the staff that periodically they would clean out his desk because it just got piled with too much stuff. And they would generally put, like, removed from his desk, and they would put the date on it. And then they would file it away in Senator's to save file. So if he ever asked, where is that, they could find it. And so among many notes about water the trees in Winder, plan for the family reunion, things like that, personal notes about family or whatever, then you would have these little snippets of where he talked to various people about some policy issue or what have you. Well, in the midst of all of that, we found the 2 pink notes about the Warren Commission. What a find. I think that's one of my favorite finds in his papers.
Also, you have a file, Sheryl, here. I said the good, the bad, and indifferent. You have a file with, if somebody wrote Senator Russell a really nasty letter, you know, a really acrimonious letter, of course the staff would try to get together a response, and usually when Senator Russell saw it, he would write at the top, nut file.
I know Senator Talmadge advised Senator Nunn to answer on the nut day. Don't let it go without an answer. He said if you lose the nut vote in Georgia, you can't go back.
Hugh, do you have a question?
Yeah, this is more of a hypothetical question, but one that's always kind of haunted me, and that is whether any of you have any thoughts or evidence that Senator Russell, through his affiliation with the CIA and the intelligence community, was aware of facts relating to the assassination that he could not disclose unless he could have them brought out in some way through a commission like this, and he felt very frustrated that that could not be accomplished.
Well, I think that one of the best example that I know of, and this may have been one of the reasons why he was so suspicious of the CIA and the FBI, is that the CIA had a program to assassinate Fidel Castro at the time President Kennedy was assassinated, and there had been 2 unsuccessful attempts to assassinate him. The Warren Commission was never told about that program. Now, Senator Russell likely knew about it, because in his capacity as chairman of the Oversight Committee, as I said earlier, he got regular briefings, but he may very well have felt that he could not, because of the restrictions under which he got that information, he couldn't just blurt it out to the Warren Commission, but it may have fed his belief that they're not telling us the whole truth. If they didn't tell us that, then what else are they not telling us? And so I think that he probably knew some information. I don't think it would have changed his view of what he stated in his dissent. But I think he probably had information. Now, Allen Dulles, a member of the commission, was head of the CIA when that program to assassinate Castro was set up, so he certainly knew about it. But the commission itself was never advised of it.
I don't have any evidence of that, but my instinct is that he knew a lot of what was going on at the CIA that the other members of the commission didn't know. That would just be, I have no facts to support that. But they say they have the CIA, when they do covert operations, they have a notification requirement. They have to notify the intelligence committees on the House side and on the Senate side. But back in the 60s, the notification requirements was to let Richard Russell know on the House side and George Mahon know on the Senate side.
Yeah,
and that's as far as they went.
You mean Mahon in the House?
Well, whatever. Mahon in the House, so Russell on the Senate side. But, you know, all that information Senator Russell had, but it was very closely held and not shared by many.
There's actually been a book written lately who this guy's promoting the theory that the Warren Commission was just one big massive cover-up, is all it amounted to. And they cite as one thing to support that is that if you wanted a real investigation, why would you appoint the senator who's head of the Oversight Committee over the CIA on it? That'd be the last person that ought to be on it. It's interesting that that argument is now being made.
And a former director of Central Intelligence, Allen Dulles.
Ms. Jean.
Could you talk about the last sentence on is it December 5th memo where he refers to remember Warren's condemnation
Of the South.
of the South, right?
Blanket indictment.
Well, I think that Warren had made some speeches, which Senator Russell interpreted as a blanket condemnation of the South. I mean, I think that many people wouldn't agree with that, but that was his view. He thought the Warren court had usurped legislative functions that were reserved to the Congress in some of its decisions, not just in civil rights, but in criminal procedure, for example. That was a big area that he felt like. And he thought that Warren had simply changed the court into a legislative body, and that if he wanted to legislate, he ought to run for public office.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone would like to ask. I think maybe we resolved the conspiracy. Well, please join us for some light refreshments before you go home, and we're very pleased to have your attendance today. Thank you.